So let's talk through the strengths and weaknesses of every unit in the Leagues of Votann army. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Leagues of Votann once more. And I thought today would go through a general overview of the units of the Codex, talk a little bit as to the positives and negatives of fielding each one, and roughly how strong they've become since Games Workshop updated all their points. Those to talk about, so let's jump straight in and go through each unit in turn, starting with the troops. First up, we've got the Hearthkyn Warriors, a 12 points per model troops choice now, and pretty much a unit that's going to be guaranteed to be necessary in most Votann army lists. They're the ones that fill patrol and battalion detachments, which I think in general you probably are going to want to do, as all the Votann stratagems are very good. Anything that saves your CP is generally going to be a good move. As for other positives, they are objective secured, so are pretty handy for holding down objectives, and I personally slightly prefer their bolters rather than their upgrade to the ion guns. I feel like mass small arms fire is particularly handy with the judgment token mechanic, and these guys can put out a fair amount of low strength hits both at range and in melee, pretty good when you're auto wounding with them. I feel like the ion guns lost out a bit when they nerfed the judgment tokens and their auto wounds on 6 thing, which made their stratagem a lot worse. Otherwise, for unit upgrades, I think that their medic upgrade is particularly standout. For just 5 points you get to ignore a failed save throw per turn, which basically guarantees that you save a Hearthkyn Warrior's life then and there, and it also gives you that pretty nice stratagem to allow you to regenerate Hearthkyn Warriors and restore some points back to the board, maybe onto objectives or things. Otherwise, for different weapons, I do think that the Magna Rail Rifle is still a really interesting pick for anti-tank duties. You're far less likely to get the splash damage out of it now with the Judgment Token nerf, but still having a massive D3+3 damage that punches straight through imball saves is going to be pretty intimidating. Otherwise, as core troops, they generally get lots of buffs from the characters, Carl rerolls, and they've got lots of access to stratagems like Heroic Intervention or Falling Back and Shooting. Finally, I do think that the Votann points update did them favours more than any other unit. They took the lowest percentage points nerf, so came out ahead of most of the other units that went up by a lot more. As for downsides, they do kind of epitomise the Votann being nice and slow and purposeful, only moving 5 inches and having quite short weapon ranges, so they might be outranged by faster moving opponents, or you might not be able to get lines of sight. You can get Sagitaur transports for them, but that does make them a lot more pricey. Though I guess one advantage of that is that it means that you can split them up between 2 different transports and create smaller units, something that could be quite handy for holding down backfield objectives for fewer points than 120. I would also say that for 12 points on a 4+ armor save, their durability is a bit so-so. Void armor helps out a bit, and there are toughness options that you can get in the codex, but if you just hit them with a high volume of low AP hits, then they are going to fold. Overall, I would say that they're pretty solid troops for the faction though. I'd expect the vast majority of lists to start with either 3 sets of them in a battalion or 2 sets in patrols, and in terms of overall power, I'd rank them 8 out of 10. Moving on to the elites next, and we have the Einhyr Hearthguard. They've gone all the way up to 45 points per model, one of the single most nerfed units out of the entire codex, and I feel like it has made these exo-armoured Votann a bit less tempting. For positives, they do have quite a lot of defensive barriers, a 2+ armor save with toughness 5, void armor and -1 damage baked in, though admittedly only having 2 wounds for 45 points still isn't all that overwhelming. Most Space Marine Terminators do wind up being tougher than them, particularly against things like damage 1-shots and mortal wounds, both of which are a lot more valuable against them than most other Terminator equivalents. Otherwise, for good stuff though, their teleport crest can jump them across the board turn 1 for a big alpha strike with some guns. It does seem like a relatively easy move to give them high Carl rerolls, pack a whole load of Vulcanite shots, jump them somewhere else on the board, and then reroll all the hit rolls to fish for 6s and just douse the enemy in loads of mortal wounds and low strength hits. It'll be pretty much guaranteed to get them in a good place for striking the enemy and hopefully somewhere annoying, but with their points per model being quite so high now, it just doesn't seem quite as attractive as a whole thing as before. Finally, for good stuff, they do have some melee capacity with the plasma blades or the concussion gauntlets. This is quite nice for the Leagues of Votann, as for squads they only really have these guys and the Cthonian Beserks, but again for their points cost they just aren't really all that great in melee. Only 2 attacks per guy was pretty underwhelming even at 35 points, never mind 45. Otherwise, when they are on the board and not teleporting, they are kind of slow and short-ranged, not particularly helpful for them potentially being ignored. Overall, I do feel that these guys are maybe one of the units that got hit hardest by the nerfs, maybe more so than I would have expected. I'd rank them a 5 out of 10 overall. I think they are going to be fielded less than most other units, but I don't think that they're unplayable, and maybe a single unit for using those teleport shenanigans could be interesting. They could maybe be an interesting target for Fortify plus the Urani Surta regulates as well. You could theoretically get these guys up to toughness 7, which would make them a lot harder to kill. Next up, we've got the other elite's choice, the Cthonian Beserks. These guys have seen a fairly monumental points increase, going from 22 points all the way up to 30. The biggest jump in the whole codex, and even more than the Land Fortress or Hearthguard in terms of percentages. These guys are fairly simple souls, they just bring ridiculous amounts of melee damage to the table, and not really a lot of fancy tricks other than that. I'd go for the concussion mauls with a big AP 3 and damage 3, those guys are hilariously destructive and have access to some very easy buffs like re-rolling all hit rolls for 1 CP, and become truly lethal if you take them in Chronos Hegemony. Defense wise, they do have some positives. They are toughness 5, 2 wounds, and have a 5+ feel no pain. If you happen to be playing Ymir Conglomerate as well, then they get a 5+ invul, which is very nice. But even with this, I still think that they're a very fragile melee unit for the cost. If they eat a round of shooting from just about anything meaningful, you're going to be losing lots of models. Even just chip damage from low AP things will tear chunks out of the unit as well. Otherwise, for advantages, they can re-roll charges. At least that could save you on command points a little bit and make low-range charges more reliable. And the squad gets to fight in death as well, which is potentially very threatening against melee armies, as if you kill these guys in combat, then they're going to go down swinging. Finally, if you want to try and mess with enemy movement via a stratagem, you could take that Mole Grenade Launcher along. I do feel it's kind of at odds with what the unit really wants to do though, which is just get into melee, and probably just wants to be advancing towards the foe if they're not able to charge, rather than sitting around and firing off Mole Grenades. As for weaknesses, these guys really do have obvious downsides. They are very slow, moving only 5 inches, and they are fairly fragile with only a 6+ save and the 5+ feel no pain. Those are a slightly horrible combination, and it means that you sort of need to invest in pricey transports to get them to the front lines, either hide them in land fortresses or Sagitaurs. Neither of those are particularly bad units, but they are kind of dependent on further investment. I feel like at their whopping points increase to 30 points, they are going to be a bit more niche in role, maybe limited to just 1 or 2 squads for counter charges, and maybe punishing enemies that are trying to get too close too quickly. I've rated them a 7 out of 10 here, as I still think that they do have some use. Maybe on the lower end of that, I could have been persuaded to give them a 6. At 150 points for a unit, I think they're going to struggle to trade out for something more destructive than them. They're only really going to have all that much success if they get into something like a heavy vehicle that doesn't really want to get hit by strength 10 damage 3 hammers. Moving on, we've got the fast attack choices, and first up we have the Hernkyn Pioneers. These bikes are 35 points per model now, so got off with a relatively small points increase, and I think as before they are still going to be one of the backbones of the Votann army lists. They just fill a lot of weaknesses that a lot of the army struggles to do. Where most of the army is at least relatively slow, these guys are fast and have fly, by far the easiest unit to get where they need to be, and on top of that they even get objectives secured as well, really nice on fast moving units that are at least somewhat threatening. I think they do have merit in being one of the cheapest Votann units outside characters, which would make them a bit better of a choice for a bit of a sacrificial piece if you need one. Though I must admit, quite a lot of the basic gear that you can take on them does seem really interesting. The Searchlight for 5 points to allow you to chuck out an easy extra judgment token is very good. The Rotary Cannon adds a lot of extra shots for an extra 10 points, and you can get both ignore cover upgrades really cheaply as well, and make them very good at killing units cowering in ruins and things. Otherwise, in terms of guns, their autocannons do put out a reasonable amount of volume fire, no doubt augmented by judgment token auto wounds, and they do have an interesting 1 command point option for a big 24-inch move in a turn. You do sacrifice any damage output with that, but being able to zip an obsec unit that far across the board could certainly have the potential to score you some more VP. Overall, for downsides though, I'd say that defense is probably their biggest one. It isn't awful with toughness 5 and void armor, but still it isn't standout for 35 points. And they might struggle to hide behind terrain very well with those very big bases. They're a bit harder to hide than, say, a jump unit might have been with a smaller footprint. Another potential weakness is that I think that fast attack slots might be at a bit of a premium in the Votann army. I think a lot of lists will both want these guys and a Sagitaur or two, and if you're taking a battalion, they're going to compete a bit. Finally, for a fairly frontline scouting unit, they don't really like melee either. Not really a great thing, as if they're parking on midfield objectives, they're quite likely to get caught up in combat. Overall though, I think they are a strong unit, didn't really get hit too hard by the points increases, and I still think we're going to see multiple units of them in most Votann lists. Overall, I'd score them a 9 out of 10. Moving on, we come to the Sagitaur, the fast attack Votann transport buggy. These things now cost 130 points per model, but again they are a usefully fast moving unit and do come with some nice general purpose firepower that's fairly long ranged. The bolt cannons should at least worry most things, and then either the auto cannons or the Sagitaur missiles both look quite interesting to me. Transports really are very handy for the slower moving infantry. Cthonian Beserks are perhaps one of the best picks to actually get that very big melee damage into combat safely, though I think that there is a good argument for using a couple of these to create some mini Hearthkyn squads. You get to split the unit at deployment, and then that can create you a little 60-point expendable unit that you could put down on objectives to do actions and things, or maybe even just to babysit a home field objective and not force you to commit excess points to it. I feel that these guys are perhaps particularly interesting in the Irani Surta regulates as well, which gets them all the way to toughness 8, which is a bit more intimidating to take down. Otherwise, I do feel that one of their biggest weaknesses is that for 130 points worth of vehicle, they're just really not all that tough to kill. Even with void armor, toughness 7 without an invul save will go down pretty fast, and even small arms will probably take its toll on this thing. Again, as mentioned before, I feel like fast attack slots might be at a bit of a premium between these and the Hernkyn. And in terms of its damage output, anything with damage -1 is going to really hurt its autocannon or bolt cannon fire. You're not going to get as much use out of the Sagitaurs if you are playing Death Guard, for example. Still though, I think that these things are usable, if a bit of a luxury. I'd score them an 8 out of 10 overall. Getting units about is really useful, and they seem like one of the most ideal units just to line up loads and loads of shots on one judgment marked target, and delete them with a bunch of bolt and autocannon fire. Moving on to the heavy support choices next, and first up we have the Brokhyr Thunderkyn. These guys are exoframe mounted engineers with heavy guns. They're now 40 points per model, and unfortunately probably one of the worst units in the entire codex. I feel like if Games Workshop had to leave one unit untouched, it probably should have been these guys, but they did go up just with everything else. The main advantages of these guys are their core infantry just dedicated as heavy weapon platforms, and they don't really do anything else. They've got okay toughness, particularly if you can get light cover on them with that void armor, and they do have some good stratagems as core infantry, things like 1 CP for fall back and shoot, or 2 CP to return fire as an enemy unit that just shot them. I guess if you really do want to make beam weapons work, then they could be one of the better units for that. You could get quite a lot of beam hits on things at longer range with their conversion beamers. The main downside for these guys though is that despite being only dedicated to firepower, you would expect that firepower to actually be quite efficient, and they do kind of struggle against the other units in the codex. The other gun platforms like Sagitaurs or land fortresses do tend to outshoot them. Perhaps the Graviton blast cannons are one of the more interesting weapon loadouts, but that one you have to get super close, which they're not going to do as they're really slow. I feel like perhaps if you did want to make them work to actually get line of sight on things, you could think about putting them in strategic reserve, but it sort of undermines the point of them being core infantry in the first place, as they're not going to be able to get buffs that easily, such as command phase buffs. Overall, I just feel that for their points cost, the guns on these guys need to be a fair bit better, and perhaps particularly the bolt cannons more so than any of them. Overall, I'd rate them a 4 out of 10, not completely and utterly unusable as a dedicated firebase in cover, but I think they're a bit of a tough sell compared with most of the other units. Next up, we've got the biggest and baddest threat of the codex, the Hekaton land fortress and the scary railgun, previously 230 points, now gone all the way up to 300, and also the railgun's Magna Rail rule is harder to trigger as you won't be able to get the splash damage from judgment tokens now. Still though, this thing remains a bit of a beast, and it can still get some very good support from the Brokhyr Iron Master, who can make them massively tougher and a bit more dangerous too. You get the choice of a few different big hitting main guns, either the Ignore Imbal's rail cannon with an average of 10 damage to fry enemy vehicles, plus the small chance of splash damage if you do luck out with that 6. Otherwise you could think about the dangerous heavy SP conversion beamer. If you can get that to line up multiple different units, then it can be really quite efficient and potentially interesting for beam weapon stratagems. On top of that, it backs it up with a whole ton of mid-strength AP2 damage 2 shots from the autocannons and bolt cannons, or maybe more beamers if you want to upgrade. They all ignore cover, and you can get some very silly buffs on this thing quite easily. It's a good one to soup up with judgment tokens, and it's particularly good for that 1 command point reroll or hits against a judgment token unit. You are buffing an awful lot of firepower if you choose to use that one. If you're running the Great Arthurian League, then you could use Uthar to still guarantee the splash damage on that rail cannon. It's no longer going to automatically hit, but you could still use that Ancestral Fortune thing on the wound roll, guaranteeing you the splash damage if you hit. The combo is now pretty pricey admittedly at 460 points, but it is still pretty mental to near guarantee deleting 10 wounds worth of models, virtually whatever it is, in 40k. Otherwise, it still remains decently tough at 16 wounds with a 2+ save and void armor. In some leagues, if you're running Einhyr or Irani Surtur, it can be tougher, either with a 4+ invul or toughness 9. It's got a bit of transport capacity that you could hide some Beserkers or Hearthkyn in, and at least for leagues of Votann, it is fairly fast. 10-inch movement is better than most other units. Still loads of stuff going for this thing. I did think at 230 points it was probably the most undercosted vehicle in 40k right now, but I still think it's going to be usable up at 300. Perhaps its biggest weaknesses are not wanting to be tied up in melee, as it can't fall back and shoot. That one could be kind of annoying on such a big and valuable vehicle, and its big profile might well struggle with terrain features and getting round them, and maybe getting line of sight on its most important targets. Still though, it seems efficient enough to run 1 or 2 per list. Overall, I score the Mighty Land Fortress an 8 out of 10 for power. Lastly, we get to the Votann HQ choices. They all went up relatively in line, small points increases, and I still think that they remain standout good characters for the codex. I'd imagine most lists will be fielding 3 or more of them. First up, we have the standard issue Karl for 80 points. He basically does the role of a Space Marine captain with some rerolls and some general purpose fighting, but perhaps the main reason to run him is his judgment tokens. Auto wounding against units all game long is excellent, and he's the main man who can make judgment tokens happen. Besides that, you can take a Rampart Crest for him, which gives you an invul save to nearby infantry. That's really quite nice on Beserks or Hearthkyn. And for an extra 40 points, you could upgrade him to a High Karl as well. That would allow him to give one unit 4 rerolls to hit per turn. Maybe some Hearthguard might be one of the best targets for that. And that one also opens up the traits to dole out more judgment tokens. He definitely does a lot of good stuff. All the Votann characters I think are very strong for the points. Perhaps one of the biggest weaknesses though for him is when the judgment tokens are given out, you have to hand them out to enemy units in line of sight before movement rather than after, and that might limit his options a bit or make him have to set up a bit more aggressively to be in the right place so he can dole out those appraising glares later in the game. While he is quite good for throwing judgment tokens at the things that most need to die, you can also get them for other sources as well, such as killing units or enemies standing on objectives. You're kind of likely to get just as many that way as you are from him, even if they are applied a bit scattergun. Overall, certainly solid enough though. I feel like most Votann armies probably will have one of these to dole out the judgment. Overall, I'd rate him an 8 out of 10. For the Great Arthurian League, they get Uthar the Destined, a unique High Karl for 160 points, and I'd basically see him as an optional upgrade on the regular High Karl if you happen to be playing that league already. He's got all the advantages that a standard High Karl would get. He's got the Rampart Crest, doling out 2 judgment tokens and the rerolls, and otherwise his melee is fairly fearsome with mortal wounds on 6s to hit. A lot tougher than most of the characters, only taking 1 damage per attack on a failed save. But I think perhaps best out of any of his options is his Ancestral Fortune rule, which guarantees you an automatic 6 to wound on 1 shot, basically guaranteeing you an auto wound with the Magna Rail Cannon on a land fortress if you wanted, and guaranteeing that splash damage. Provided the thing actually lands its hit, then it's almost guaranteed to wipe out a whole unit each turn, and that is really quite nice, seeing as both the land fortress has other guns, and this guy can be commanding other units all while doing that combo. On the downsides, it is an ability that you pay quite a lot of points for. 160 points is by far the most expensive HQ choice, even after upgrades. It's locked to the Great Arthurian League, so it's not going to be any good if you're happening to play Einhyr Conglomerate perhaps, and while he does have good damage and defense in combat, within wider 40k his melee stat line isn't enormously scary at 160 points. It's okay, but he's more of a buffing HQ than he is a brutal frontline one. Overall, I'd rate him an 8 out of 10, probably largely due to the silly rail cannon combo. Otherwise, I think you're probably a bit better just going for a standard Karl and saving the points if you're not trying to make daft things like that happen. 90 points for the Votann specific Psyker, and another HQ choice that brings a lot to the table. He's 90 points or 115 if you take the Lord Grimnir upgrade, and just being a Psyker in the first place is kind of handy. He can help deny enemy powers and use a stratagem to prevent maledictions nearby, and also allow you to use that Psychic Interrogation secondary if it makes sense to. The powers from his Scheme Wrought discipline are pretty useful. I think the command point farming one is almost always going to get taken. 4 or 5 more command points over the game is pretty excellent, given how powerful all the Votann stratagems are. Otherwise, perhaps some of the most interesting are Fortify to make a unit tougher and give them a feel no pain. That's really nice on both Hearthkyn and Hearthguard, I think, and stripping invuls from a unit up close is pretty good as well. Could make any high AP shots that bit more scary. Otherwise, he also brings some morale buffs to nearby units, a little bit of shooting from those corvs, and the corvs also stop him from suffering perils while they live. My guess would be that most lists might just leave him as the standard Grimnir. For an extra 25 points you could upgrade to the Lord one though for more flexible powers and easier to cast when there's judgment marked units around. Plus he's got quite a fun relic staff that you could take that combos quite well with the Lord option. On the downside, he is fragile if he's exposed, he hasn't got much melee power, and he does stop you from taking the Abhor the Witch secondary if that makes sense against Grey Knights or Thousand Sons. I think you'd have to weigh up whether or not the bonus command points plus Fortify are really worth it for the Psyker, though he could always switch to a little bit of mortal wound damage with Smite if the enemy gets close. Overall I'd rank him an 8 out of 10, a very usable faction Psyker. I think he's going to appear in a fair few lists. Next up we've got the Brokhyr Ironmaster, the Votann Engineer. He's 90 points for his little unit, and he's a character model that comes attached with 3 cog robots plus an Einhyr assistant. This guy did have his ridiculous damage combos toned down a fair bit in the Judgment token change, but he still brings an awful lot of good stuff to the table in just surprising amounts of ridiculous layers of buffs for land fortresses and potentially a few other units as well. In general, if you're bringing a land fortress or two along, then it makes sense to have this guy nearby. He can give 1+1 to hit and repair D3+1 wounds per turn, both of which are pretty nice, and if the enemy does get close to Menace's creations, then you get a little bit of shooting as well from his grav gun, the Einhyr's beam shot, and a little bit of melee from the grav hammer and his assistants. While none of the models are really all that tough individually, they do have quite bagged saves. At least it is kind of annoying that you have to chew through an entire unit of them rather than just one character. So that does add a little bit of survivability against, say, individual las cannon shots or something. But then I think the really good stuff for this guy gets going once you upgrade him to the Forge Master for another 25 points, and that I'd consider almost auto-include if you were running one. That one gives you -1 command points for any nearby war gear stratagems each turn. That can include some pretty useful ones, such as the teleport one to jump Einhyr somewhere, or maybe the overcharged shield crest for the transhuman physiology. On top of that, if you also take the Warlord trait, you can also heal an extra wounds to land fortresses per turn, so that would be 4 wounds worth of big tank restored. It makes his weapons do mortal wounds on 6s to wound, potentially giving his attacks a fair bit of a nasty sting in the tail if you do get lucky. And perhaps the best bit of all is that he gets to negate one incoming attack's damage characteristic, so you could save something like a big D3+3 shot damage that's come in on a land fortress and make it turn into nothing. Just between that and the repairs, you could be saving something like 80 points worth of land fortress in a single turn, never mind all the other stuff that he does. Perhaps his main weaknesses are that he really needs vehicles in the list to be all that useful. He is at least fairly fragile if he gets exposed to volume fire, and Games Workshop did basically turn off his big mortal wound deluge that he could spit out with a few command points, and pretty much negated him back to being a standard buffing character, not just a buffing character that can blow away entire chunks of units in a turn with that grav gun. Still though, for his points cost I think he's absolutely excellent value. I'd rate him a 9 out of 10. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the Einhyr Champion, the brutal dwarven melee mauler, who's 110 points, but 120 points if you take the hammer, which frankly I would. This guy's all about the big damage output. He hits very hard at damage D3+3 with that hammer, plus I think a lot of people would take the relic hammer, which allows you to get mortal wounds on hit rolls of a 6, potentially averaging something like 8 or 9 mortal wounds per turn if you use a full hit rerolls option like a High Carl or a Judgment token stratagem. Between those and his regular damage, he'll usually leave a big hole in most units. Otherwise, compared with the other characters, he is enormously tough. His toughness 5 with -1 damage, a big 2+ save with void armor, a 4+ invul if you take the shield crest, and in combat he's even got a -1 to wound in melee as well, potentially meaning that anything hitting with a strength of 4 will only wound him on a 6. Generally he seems like a pretty excellent countercharge threat, hiding in the lines to strike out and hit big. He does have a couple of other nice tricks as well, including an accelerated boost move that you can do to get in a threatening position, though he can't charge after that, and he can allow nearby Einhyr Hearthguard to reroll wound rolls of 1 as well if you do happen to be fielding those. He does have a little bit of anti-infantry shooting too, with that Ortox Stormbolter. As for downsides, aside from just raw melee damage and being fairly tough, he doesn't do all that much. Most of the other HQs do add quite a lot to the army generally, rather than just hitting hard, and he is competing against some other very good HQ choices. If the opponent does feel like they need to avoid him, they might well be able to. He only moves 5 inches, so his average threat range isn't particularly high, and even if he does get there, that mortal wound hammer can be pretty swingy. If you don't roll any 6s to hit, then you're not getting any mortal wounds, and you could also get unlucky with the big damage characteristic and have it ping off some invuls. Still though, a very good combat capable melee character, he will hit enormously hard against the right targets, and overall I'd rank him an 8 out of 10. So with that brings us to the end of the Votann Codex, and a quick look at each unit contained within. Overall, compared with the first points cost in the Codex, I do feel that a few of them have been hit pretty hard by the nerfs, particularly the Hearthkyn Beserks and the Thunderkyn, but the majority of the rest of the Codex does still seem very usable and really quite intimidating with auto wound judgment tokens going about. Let me know your thoughts on the units and how strong you think they are, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more content on the Leagues of Votann. We've still got plenty more units to talk about in individual summaries, and I'm looking forward to looking over some competitive lists when they do hit the tournament scene. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and that's the main thing that allows me to keep them coming quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.